Today we'll be covering the biggest model that we've seen on the channel so far, the Warhound Titan. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. Today we'll be taking a look at a mighty god machine of the Imperium of Man and one of the classic Forge World models, the Warhound Titan. I'm well aware that this thing doesn't have the most efficient rules in 8th edition, but the model is absolutely epic and a treat to see it on the table whenever one's about, so I thought we'd take a look at his rules anyway. In this video we'll take a quick look at his background, go over the model's datasheet including some maths on his main guns, talk about a couple of buffs and synergies for the Scout Titan, and how I would think to try and get the most out of him in an actual game of 40k these days. In the background, the Warhound is actually the smallest class of Imperial Titan, though of course it dwarfs some of the mightiest war machines that the enemies of man can bring to bear. It is typically deployed as a scout and flanking element of a Titan Legion, and it often hunts in packs, with multiple Warhound Titans typically being fielded in conjunction. The standard Warhound has a crew of 5, with its command officer known as a Titan Princeps, who is cybernetically linked to the mechanical beast via its mind impulse unit. 2 junior officers crew the weapon systems, which are further augmented by servitors hardwired into the guns themselves. Finally, 2 tech priests harness the Titan's mighty plasma generator, directing the flow of power to the weapon's maneuverability and the void shields as needed. Warhounds can often deploy different weapon systems depending on the foe they're expecting to be fighting, between the fearsome turbo laser destructor or anti-infantry configurations such as the plasma blast gun or Vulcan mega bolter. So overall very scary. Let's take a look at its stats in 8th edition then. So as you might expect, an Imperial Warhound Titan is a Lord of War choice for Adeptus Titanicus and the Imperium. Each Warhound will cost you a full 2,000 points, meaning that it isn't really feasible to field them in many normal games of Warhammer 40k. It's armed with 2 weapons taken from its War Gear options list, and can also crush opponents between its titanic stride. For this exceptional price tag you get quite an impressive profile. Its movement is 24 inches when undamaged, so it's getting around the board faster than virtually anything else. It has weapon skill 5+, and ballistic skill 2+, so is far more effective at range than in melee, strength 10, toughness 9, so abnormally strong against las cannons and the like, 35 wounds, 4 attacks, leadership 10 and a 3-up save. That 3-up save is further augmented by its void shield save, which essentially functions like an invul save, except it can also be taken against mortal wounds as well. Unfortunately, the Warhound Titan is hindered by a pretty punishing damage table. It only has to lose 6 wounds before it is bracketed, its movement dropping to 18, ballistic skill to 3+, and its void shield to only 5+, meaning that its durability actually degrades as it takes damage. It then degrades again at 19 wounds, only 12-inch movement this time, 6-up weapon skill, 4+ ballistic skill, and only a 6+ void shield save. This really is a shame considering almost every vehicle in the game only degrades when it gets to half of its wounds left, so to be bracketed twice even before you've got to that level really does the Warhounds no favours at all. It's a bit painful to have 2,000 points performing suboptimally just because it's taken 1 or 2 unsaved las cannon hits. We'll look at its weapons in just a second, but I thought we'd quickly go through its special rules first. First of all, it has the Imperial God Engine special rule, which is the fairly standard knight and big creature invulnerability to getting locked up. It can fall back in the movement phase and still shoot and charge in the same turn, and when it falls back it can fall back over enemy infantry models, though interestingly not things such as swarms, which is a bit of an oversight really. Furthermore, it can still fire all of its shooting weapons even if it's in close combat, unless it's within 1 inches of an enemy with Titanic, and it can move and fire without any penalty to its ballistic skill. Should you ever want to advance it, it has the flank speed special rule, increasing its movement characteristic by 12 inches instead of rolling a dice when it does advance, although frankly when you're paying 2,000 points for a model, you really can't afford to be having it advance for a turn, so you're very rarely going to want to do this. Its explosion is extra nasty with a cataclysmic explosion. It blows up on a 5+, and then it showers units within 3d6 inches with d6 mortal wounds apiece. If this goes up in either your army or your opponent's army, you're most certainly going to lose a horrendous amount of models. So overall, it's a unit that's going to live or die by how powerful its guns are, so let's have a talk about them. So you have 4 options to choose from: the Turbo Laser Destructor, the Titanic Plasma Blast Gun, the Vulcan Mega Bolter, and the Inferno Gun. They all cost the same, so let's have a look at their profiles. The Turbo Laser Destructor has a 96-inch range, is 2d3 shots, strength 16, AP -3, and a whopping damage of 2d6. It has the macro special rule, meaning that it will do double damage against Titanic units, and if you make a wound roll of a 6, the target also takes another d3 mortal wounds, just in case that was ever going to make a difference. In terms of numbers, that translates to about 3 dead Space Marine intercessors, presuming that we're firing on our top bracket, an average of 17 wounds on a toughness 7 or 8 vehicle that doesn't have an invul save, which will likely remove the vast majority of those from the game, and on average a whopping 27 wounds on a Titanic unit with a 5+ invul save, such as an Imperial Knight. So a Warhound with 2 of these could have a very real chance of one-shotting 2 different Imperial Knights in one turn. Not bad for if you're having an enormous game of 40k and fielding multiple super heavies. These could do a lot of work. Moving on, we have the Plasma Blast Gun. This one's also a macro weapon with a 72-inch range, 2d6 shots. When it overcharges, it's strength 10, AP -4, and damage 4. If it doesn't overcharge, it's only strength 8, AP -3, and damage 3, but you don't get the chance of suffering mortal wounds on a roll of 1. This one's better against the intercessors, killing around 5 on average. Does just about as good against standard vehicles with 16 wounds on them, and is no slouch against super heavies either with the 21 wounds on an Imperial Knight on average. So generally a bit better against very elite infantry, and about the same on vehicles unless they have an invul save like that Knight does, which counteracts the decent AP, in which case the turbo laser wins out. Both are pretty fearsome though, and have a very good chance of just one-shotting certain units. The flat damage 4 could be particularly good against Centurions and things. Next we have the Titan Vulcan Mega Bolter, which is the best against infantry in the vast majority of cases. This one has a very long range again at 72 inches, 20 shots of strength 6, AP -3, damage 2 goodness. It doesn't have the macro keyword, so is no better against knights, but on average this almost wipes out an entire full squad of intercessors per turn, but struggles a lot more against hard targets, only doing about 9 wounds to a standard toughness 7 or 8 vehicle, and being even worse against Imperial Knights that have invul saves, so a lot stronger against infantry, particularly elite infantry with 2 wounds. Finally we have the Inferno Gun, the enormous flamethrowers, which is very close range at 18 inches. This one's 46 auto hits with strength of 7, AP -3, and again a flat 4 damage. This one's very strong against infantry, around 8 dead intercessors, about 23 wounds against your standard vehicle that's toughness 7, but obviously it'll suffer a bit more against toughness 8 with only strength 7, and it drops off a fair bit against the Imperial Knight, only doing about 16 wounds on average. So it does have a fairly decent all-round profile, particularly against targets that are toughness 7 or less, but having to get within 18-inch range is a significant disadvantage compared with the others, which can reach out and touch units on the other side of the table. Overall, I do think that these guns are fairly well balanced, depending on exactly what you're looking for. I'm not the biggest fan of the Vulcan Mega Bolter, just because it's going to be a bit underwhelming against literally anything besides Primaris intercessors. If you are playing a big Apocalypse-style game of Warhammer 40k, then probably the best value that you can get out of it is as a hunter for vehicles and super heavies with that turbo laser, though both the Plasma Blast Gun and the Inferno Guns aren't too bad either, and are a little bit more flexible as to their targeting. Finally, its stomp attacks can do a decent amount of work in close combat as well. On its starting profile with 12 attacks at hitting on a 5+, that strength 10, AP -3 and flat damage of 3 will typically do 2 or 3 unsaved wounds on your standard vehicle, resulting in an average of 7 damage. So if you can engage the enemy in close combat, and it's not going to put you at risk of massive countercharge, or the unit isn't actually going to kill you itself in close combat, then there's no reason for it not to be there, particularly if you could do something clever with movement to stop the enemy unit falling back, because then the Warhound Titan could just blaze away with all of its guns, and the enemy wouldn't actually be able to shoot it. Potential for a very funny, crafty manoeuvre there. In terms of any way that we can get more out of the Titan, there really are very limited options for giving buffs to random Imperial vehicles, as Games Workshop doesn't generally want to allow units just like this to get enormous buffs from the various different codexes about. Probably the most simple and easy to apply buff to the Warhound is Guilliman's Aura, which will allow the Warhounds to reroll ones to hit, which is pretty powerful on such an enormous unit, so it'll get a bit of extra damage output, and also getting +1 to your movement isn't too bad either. Besides that, I've been really struggling for buffs that other Imperial units can get. I'm not 100% certain how big the Warhound Titan is, and whether it would fit within the Castellan's 5-up invul save aura for Iron Aegis, but that could potentially be a way to get it an invul save even after its void shields degrade, and you could potentially have a Hawkshroud Knight overwatch an enemy that's charging into it, although if they weren't put off by the Titan's guns, I'm not sure exactly what one more Imperial Knights overwatch would do. It's also pretty limited in terms of stratagems, Certainly a command point reroll here and there won't go amiss, most notably to reroll the number of shots on one of those turbo lasers or the plasma blast gun if you roll really low. A surprise interrupt in close combat could also be quite a good thing when you have a decent amount of melee power, and this thing does, to be honest. When in game, the Warhound's a reasonably straightforward unit to use. You're just going to be wanting to deploy those 2 massive guns to annihilate 2 enemy units each turn, as aside from charging, it can't actually do damage to more than 2 units in a turn, so every turn it doesn't have an optimal target in sight is a turn wasted. In general, I'd tend to fire its main armaments at enemy vehicles or super heavies that haven't taken any damage, as you do have the potential to roll incredibly high for some of these weapons, so it's best to give yourself the chance of just rolling very high and one-shotting a key target straight off the table with no other effort expended. Despite toughness 9, 35 wounds and a void shield save, the Scout Titans really aren't all that tough for their points cost. For example, if you were playing Imperial Knights and you put all of those points into Knight Crusaders, you'd get 102 wounds at toughness 8, but with invuls that stayed around for the whole game. So while tough individually, the Warhound Titan isn't really tough at an army-wide level, and at 2000 points it does need to be as tough as a whole army. That being said, having all that durability in one place does mean that you could focus down one half of the army, maybe move it to crush one enemy flank while ignoring the other, and then using its decent movements to address the second half of the army, hopefully once it's laid waste to multiple enemy units on the one side. Melee and incredibly fighty characters is going to be one of the easiest ways to put a lot of damage on it at once, so you'd be wanting to stay away from things like Space Marine Smash Captains and any Imperial Knights with powerful close combat gear, as a lot of these guys often have strength 10 or higher. So if these threats are about, you want to be keeping the Titans screened, but if you do have a big enemy army that's advancing towards you, certainly consider doing a bit of a countercharge if it's going to swing the balance and finish off an already damaged enemy unit. Although scary high-strength threats might threaten it in close combat, it is going to be pretty much immune to damage to more normal units with medium to low strength. Overall, at the moment, the Warhound's points cost is just far too high to include it in any sort of competitive game. At any rate, at 2000 points, the most common points cost that competitive games of 40k are played at, you are going to be able to get this Titan and literally nothing else. I'm not saying that it's not possible to win certain games like that, particularly against incredibly elite armies, but in some games it certainly will be mathematically impossible. Particularly if your opponent has a large amount of units, you're only going to be able to deal with so many threats, and you're only ever going to be able to score one objective at a time in ideal circumstances. In particular, the Warhound Titan is really underwhelming against infantry, so any 2000 points list with a reasonable amount of troops knows that it should easily be able to survive the entire game despite the incredibly high firepower. I do think that massive units like the Warhound Titan lost out the most when blast templates were removed, which stopped them from taking out multiple units a turn with those enormous macro weapons, when previously you might have been able to cover multiple units with the same blast template and take out, say, an entire squadron of tanks if you got lucky. So at the moment it's very much a unit for more casual games of 40k where you just want to put some models on the table and trade blows with some god machines. But it will be interesting to see how Games Workshop redoes the Forge World rules when their rules team revamps the books, as they're rumoured to do shortly. I'll certainly be watching with interest with what happens to the Adeptus Titanicus. Thanks very much for listening to another Auspex Tactics video. If you'd like to see more 40k content like this, feel free to subscribe to the channel, and let me know what sort of Forge World units you'd like to see next down in the comments. If you'd like to help support the channel, then I do have a Patreon page. Making all of these videos takes quite a lot of time, so if you are enjoying the content, then any support that you can spare would be greatly appreciated. And of course, a big thank you to my current patrons who help make this channel a possibility. Thanks again for listening. I'll hope to see you guys next time.